Tonight on the Delphi Debrief, 2 years after Richard Allen was charged with the murders of Abby Williams and Libby German, the jury in the Delphi murders trial hears from the forensic expert who tried to find DNA evidence at the crime scene. Plus, on Saturday, we heard more testimony from the state police officer who told the jury that Allen said it's over before his arrest. Thanks for inviting us in. This is your Delphi Debrief here on WTHR+. This was day 9 of the Delphi murders trial. In a moment, we'll hear from our legal expert, Katie Jackson-Lindsay. But first, our senior investigative reporter Bob Siegel and reporter Emily Longnecker are in Delphi right now. Richard Allen, as you know, is charged in the murders of Abby and Libby 2 years ago. But today we heard there's no DNA evidence connecting Allen to this crime, right?
Yeah, Scott, we got some very technical and very scientific testimony today. One talking about DNA evidence, another talking about blood patterns. It made for a really hard day for both the families and for the jurors in court.
Yeah, and I would say everybody in court that had to see those crime scene photos again. Again, very technical testimony from that blood spatter expert, but it also became emotional because he was literally describing the last moments of Abby and Libby's lives. Absolutely.
Let's get you up to speed right now on the 2 witnesses who testified today. The first, Stacy Bozinovski. She is the state's 27th witness to take the stand, and she is a DNA analyst who works for the Indiana State Police Crime Lab in Indianapolis. She tested dozens and dozens of pieces of evidence from the crime scene to see if the state could detect if the killer left behind any DNA. And the second witness, Pat Cicero. He is a major with the LaPorte County Sheriff's Department, and he's a longtime crime scene reconstructionist. His specialty is as a blood pattern stain analyst, and he testified about the huge amount of blood at the crime scene and how he thinks it got there. We'll begin with the DNA testimony. Bozinovski, she is the lady on the right side of the video you're seeing. She told the jury she tested clothing from Abby and Libby found at the murder scene, skin cells from under their fingernails, blood found on their bodies and on the ground and from a nearby tree. The big conclusions from the state's DNA expert: Richard Allen's DNA was not found anywhere at the crime scene, including on the cartridge that the prosecutor claims came from one of Allen's guns. And the other big conclusion, she says Abby and Libby's DNA was not found on any of the items taken from Allen's home when investigators served a search warrant there. She also testified that specimens from the sexual assault test kits administered on Abby and Libby's bodies showed no signs or DNA to suggest that sexual assault took place. Bozinovski said there was some male DNA found in evidence from the crime scene, but she said that's not unusual to find in the environment naturally or on clothes washed in a family's washing machine, for example. She said the only definitive male whose DNA was found at the scene belonged to someone who works in the state crime lab. Again, nothing from Richard Allen. And keep in mind, this testimony came from a witness presented by the state. Hearing what the state's expert had to say, you might think that this testimony actually came from the defense. It was not. It came from the state, and it seemed to be an attempt on the state's part to really get out in front of what the jury is going to hear the defense say, which is the fact that there was no DNA tying Richard Allen to the crime scene in any way whatsoever helps to prove that he did not commit the murders. The defense, though, they did have a chance to come up and cross-examine the witness, and they took their time and spent over an hour doing that, and they kind of pounded away at this witness.
Yeah, they did. And, you know, on that cross, Bozinovski said, look, DNA technology is always advancing. It's ever changing, kind of as a reason, giving a reason for holding on to some of the hair evidence that they have, but also testifying that they sent 72 hairs to the FBI for analysis. And Jennifer Auger asking, well, could you have tested more? Could you have sent it to other labs? And Bozinovski saying the decision was made not to test them at this time. And if we want to put up this quote here from Jennifer Auger, she said, "But this is the time. Richard Allen is on trial now." And she said that very emphatically, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. And Bozinovski said, Richard Allen is on trial now.
That's a moment that really stood out.
It did.
Where, you know, it's like, hey, you had your chance
Right.
to be able to do additional testing. Specifically, she was talking about hair follicles that were found
Right.
at the crime scene. And she said, hey, this wasn't my call.
Right.
You know, we made the decision not to test it right now. And it's like, hey, you've got... This is the time.
Right.
He's on
Here we
trial
are.
right now. We don't have more time
Exactly.
to test
And
it.
she said, look, it's at the discretion of the investigators. They basically tell her what to test. And she also testified that they were only looking for male DNA. And Jennifer Auger asked her, well, why? And Bozinovski said, you know, I had reason to believe based on the case history that this was a male perpetrator. So we only focused on men, basically. We also found out some of the items taken from Richard Allen's home that they tested for DNA, for Richard Allen's DNA, his blue Carhartt jacket, that they took a swash of carpet from his car, some of his knives that they took during that search warrant, his boots, and of course that cartridge that was found at the scene between Abby and Libby. You know, the jury coming out of this, the cross and the back and forth, they had 8 questions.
They did.
And technical ones. A lot about security, too.
I wrote down some of those questions, and some of the questions from the jury just, to me, were mind-boggling.
Right.
One of the questions, what types of quality controls are utilized for DNA reagents? Another question they asked, how do you handle chimeras? Chimeras, I believe it's pronounced?
Right.
That's someone who would show DNA, having evidence of DNA in their body from more than one person. For
Right.
example, like someone who might have a blood transfusion.
That's how they explained it.
There's at least one juror sending questions to the judge to ask the witness who really knows
Must
a
know
lot
something.
about
Yes.
DNA. And
For sure.
that really surprised me, Scott. So the jury again today taking lots of notes, paying very close attention to the testimony, even though it was really dense and really technical testimony that we got this morning.
All right, Bob and Emily, thanks so much. We'll get back to you shortly. We want to bring in our legal analyst, Katie Jackson-Lindsay. All right, so what do you make of the fact that they do this DNA testing on the crime scene and don't find any DNA of Richard Allen at the crime scene?
Well, I think it's remarkable and it's significant for sure, because that's a win for the defense, right? But it might not necessarily be a loss for the state because they didn't find unknown male DNA of some other mystery person either. So undoubtedly, we will see them argue in closing arguments, hey, Richard Allen's DNA is not there, but there's also no other person's DNA there that's not accounted for. And so therefore, the killer arguably just was able to pull this off without leaving any DNA behind.
Okay, speaking of DNA, I think the other thing that we learned today from this testimony from this expert testified that Richard Allen's blue jacket, his black boots, his knives were all tested, and the girl's DNA was not on any of those items.
And that I think is more remarkable, right? Because like I said, they could argue that whoever committed this crime didn't leave their DNA behind. But now what we know is that this was a really bloody crime scene. Those girls' DNA would have been all over the perpetrator of this crime through blood DNA, right? And so the idea that their blood was not found in his vehicle, their blood was not found anywhere in his home, not on any of the knives, not on the jacket, not on the boots that they are accusing him of wearing when he perpetrated this crime. That is a bigger issue, I think, of not finding their DNA than not finding his, because they didn't find any other person's either. But even on that point, I suspect that the state will argue that based on the amount of time that has passed, he could have washed that clothing, he could have had his car cleaned, and it was 5 years. And those type of bodily fluids will deteriorate somewhat over that passage of time, as will the integrity or the composition of any DNA that might have been there.
Do you think the jury members, hearing that there's no DNA of Richard Allen at the crime scene, think, well, how could he be guilty?
Potentially. I think they most certainly are probably thinking that right now in this moment, because there's not been any argument about it. And that's one of the challenges of putting on a criminal case for either side. When you are presenting your witnesses, all that you can do is present the facts. You can't make any arguments about the facts in that moment. And so it's really going to fall on the state to really tie this up for the jury and explain why they shouldn't just assume that he wasn't there because his DNA wasn't there, and vice versa. It's going to be on the defense to explain to them why this is a really big deal.
All right, we're going to get more from Katie coming up in a minute, but let's go back to you guys in Delphi and find out more about that second witness that was on the witness stand today.
Before we mention that, Scott, there was an interesting dialogue from the judge that came right before the lunch break today. This was at the end of the discussion regarding the DNA, or at least wrapping up the morning session, and it came after, again, several hours of talking about some really technical DNA issues. And before we broke for lunch, Judge Gull looked out into the gallery and she said, I realize that it's kind of hot in here and this has been going on for a while, but she said, I've noticed some of you out in the gallery sleeping. And then she said, let me pull up her exact quote. She said, I do not conduct court in your bedrooms. I would appreciate you not sleeping in my courtroom. And I guarantee you that was the last time today that anyone closed their eyes for more than a second or two in the courtroom.
Right, absolutely.
So yeah, let's move on now to the blood spatter testimony today. Yeah. Some really tough testimony given in court, and I guess I should warn our viewers that even us talking about it and recounting what we heard in court today, it's extremely graphic. So we want to warn you about some of that.
Yeah, graphic because, you know, as Pat Cicero was talking about the last moments of Abby and Libby's lives, we're seeing the crime scene photos, sometimes very close up.
For a second time.
For a second time. And I think we talked about, and other people talked about, we heard this before, we saw them last week, and somehow today, at least for me, and I think you said it for you, and I heard a couple other people say it was harder today. And maybe it was because of the narrative going along with it. It was so technical, it was so graphic, and again, we saw those jurors, especially that one gentleman who always puts his head in his hands. He would not look at those photos at all.
In addition to that juror, though, today really struggling with that, and there's one juror who sits in seat 6 who has really struggled, and again today he had his head down and his face got bright red, and he really couldn't bring himself to look at the photos. Right. These really tight graphic pictures of Abby and Libby and their wounds, but the juror I noticed in seat 11 and in seat 12, they at one point just both looked at one another and they just shook their head, and at portions of the testimony when these pictures were being shown, they stared off just into the distance. I saw juror 5. She looked away multiple times. These are photographs that are they're really, really disturbing.
Disturbing. You can't unsee them. Basically, you cannot unsee them. So this testimony came from Major Pat Cicero out of LaPorte County. This is his 34th time testifying in a case. He told the jury he was brought into this case this past February, and he reviewed crime scene photos, autopsy photos, diagrams of the crime scene, DNA reports. He also testified that he examined Abby Williams' clothes, and he went to the crime scene this past April. His job, basically, Major Cicero's job, basically, is to put all of these things together and try and figure out exactly what happened at that crime scene. And Cicero described the area, the crime scene area that he went to this April, as a bowl, a depression, if you will, is what he said, kind of an area that goes down where their bodies were found, almost like a bowl shape. And he talked about the trees at the crime scene. That smaller tree he described as having a blood stain on it 4 feet from the base, and then a pool of blood about 2 to 3 feet north of that tree. On that tree, he talked about the stain being an upside down L, having blood spatters to the left. He called it a transfer stain, that basically a bloody object had come into contact with that tree, and we later learned that he believes that that bloody object was Libby German's hand. Then he talked about another stain on that same tree on the north side, just, he said, around the corner from the L stain, and that stain is 2 feet from the base, another transfer stain, and he described that as a more voluminous amount of blood. Voluminous is a word that Pat Cicero used several times today. Voluminous amount of blood.
He did. And Emily, I thought some of the most interesting testimony that he gave today was really talking about where he thinks Abby and Libby were positioned at the times that they were attacked by the murderer.
Yeah. Also, we want to talk about, he explained the process of examining this blood, how you put a chemical on it, and I couldn't pronounce it or spell it when he said it, but it turned the blood at the scene, especially on the tree, like a violet color, so that they could look at it better to try and explain what happened. And he called that upside down L stain interesting in detail. The margins were smooth, uniform, and even. So he took each young lady, first he started with Libby, and basically went through all of the blood on her body and what he thinks happened. He brought up the photos again of her, and that's when the jury became visibly upset, and a lot of folks became upset. He described her having, and we saw the picture, she had blood on the bottom of her right foot, and he said it was consistent with Miss German moving and basically walking in blood. Then he said that there was a huge amount of blood on her hands, and he basically said, and this was, I think, just a god-awful detail when he talked about basically, and he's seen this in other victims, that it is a normal reaction when you have a wound on your neck that you would grab your neck with both hands, and he thinks that Libby did that after one of the wounds that she received, that she put her hands on her neck. I think, though, the most difficult part of this was when he testified about the moisture that they found on Libby's face, and explaining that it hadn't rained the night before or during that day, and that the moisture was consistent with tears, and that's when you saw people break down.
With
that's
tears,
when,
and at that moment, I was able to see Libby's grandmother out of the corner of my eye, and she has really tried to be stoic throughout these proceedings, even when the photos were shown. But at that moment, she lowered her head, she put her head in her hands, and she started crying, and certainly understandably so, to hear that your granddaughter
was crying.
The last moments of her life,
she was crying.
there were tears.
Yeah. We also learned that Pat Cicero believes at one point Libby was sitting down. So, and he talked about this, that there was at least the initial wound. Then she is consistently moving, steps in blood. At one point, he feels like she's seated, and that's where a majority of the blood flows out of her after she's moving a few feet. And then he believes that she passed there, and then later was dragged to the tree. And he talked about believing that she was dragged based on the photos that he saw of the leaves that were stuck basically to her leg and her backside. When they turned her over, they saw a lot of leaves. Even though the defense brought up, look, in the diagram of that crime scene, we don't see anything that indicates that investigators thought there was any kind of dragging at the scene. And so the defense brought that up. But nonetheless, Pat Cicero believes that someone dragged Libby over to the next tree. Then he moved on to Abby Williams. He talked about how the blood near Abby is very, very different. Only a small amount of pooling he described at her right arm and right shoulder. And he described no blood stains on the sleeves or her arms or her hands. And he said it was very unusual to not have blood on her hands. And we know when they found her that her hands were tucked inside the sleeves of Libby's sweatshirt, as if they have described it before, as if in a fighting position, like, kind of putting your dukes up, but nonetheless no blood on her hands, and he described that as very unusual. He said that the blood went from the one wound in her neck over her chin and into her mouth, and he believed that she was wearing the sweatshirt that she was wearing, Libby's sweatshirt, when she was killed, and he based that on the amount of saturation in the sweatshirt. And Pat Cicero believes that Abby succumbed to her injuries right at the location that she was found. She was in a supine position, facing up. And this was another quote that was very hard to hear. There was no evidence to show that she died immediately. Yes. So we know that it was not immediate that these young women suffered. When he was asked about why no blood on her hands, he talked about the different possibilities, that that 1, she could have been bound, but there's no evidence of that,
Right.
he said. 2, that she could have been unconscious. And 3, that she was restrained. But in his opinion, quote, she was wearing the sweatshirt at the time she was killed. He also testified it's possible at least one person could have committed this crime. But on the cross, the defense said to him, but is it possible that it could have been committed by more than one? And he said, I can't rule that out. I can't rule that out. So,
So some of the big takeaways that we heard from that is this blood spatter expert said that he believed that at least one of the girls' bodies was moved.
dragged Libby's.
After she died.
Right.
He indicated that he believed, again, keep in mind, this all happened at what they refer to as ground zero.
Ground
so
zero.
about this 20-yard area in diameter. And he believes that there's one spot that has a fair amount of blood there.
Right.
That is where Libby was attacked.
Yes.
And then on the other side of that perimeter area is where she actually died.
Yes.
With
even more blood.
With even way more blood
that
at that particular
Yes.
site, because he said that is where it appears that she would have died from her injuries.
Right.
And then her body was dragged.
Right.
And again, he believes that Abby Williams, she died in the spot where she was
Injured,
attacked
yes.
and where she was injured.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
very interesting testimony that came from that expert.
The defense also, they were trying to argue, is it possible that Libby German could have been picked up by more than one person and not dragged? And Pat Cicero pretty much sticking to the idea that she was dragged, he said, based on those leaves that were stuck to her leg, because he talked about blood, having an adhering quality, and that things stick to blood. So he talked about that. They also tried to talk about, they wanted to question him about the sticks that were left on the girls, saying, is it possible that they were not for concealment? And he basically talked about, well, it's pretty much whatever, depends on your point of view, whether they conceal it or not. It depends on where you're looking at the crime scene, whether you think that those sticks conceal. But he could not rule out, the defense asked him about this, he could not rule out that someone had washed Abby Williams' hands or was holding her down when she was attacked. He could not rule that out when he was asked, by the defense.
And Scott, we should point out, again, one of the main reasons that this blood spatter expert was brought in, and during cross-examination there was quite a bit of criticism on the part of the defense that this blood spatter expert was not brought in
right
until
away.
7 years,
7 years later.
And it's an indication, as the state was preparing to present its case, there have been allegations, and one of the theories presented by the defense is that the blood mark on the tree that has Libby's blood on it was very intentional, and it was placed there as a sign by the killer that this was not an accidental mark on the tree. And we heard Mr. Cicero talk about that today.
Right. He talked about that he believes, he can't rule that out, but he believes that it was put there by her hand, that this was her hand. Yeah.
So important detail, Scott, that the jury heard today, but it certainly came at an emotional price for the jury and for everybody in the courtroom.
Yeah, Bob and Emily, thank you so much for recounting that for our audience tonight. I just can't even imagine what this must have been like for the family to sit through hours of testimony when we're talking about blood and their two daughters. So thank you so much for that update. We'll get back to you. Let's bring Katie back in for a little bit more analysis. Based on the blood evidence and the testimony that we heard from the expert in this case, who's been looking at the crime scene, what do you make of what you've heard?
I think this is evidence that we are going to see highly scrutinized during the defense's case. In my 16 years of experience as a criminal lawyer, I've never heard from this type of expert, and I think that's in part because this is really subjective. It's very speculative, and it's drawing on a lot of assumptions in terms of what the sequence of events were simply by reviewing photos. It's remarkable to me that we learned that this expert reached these conclusions based on photos for a number of reasons. One, because those photos are taken from some other person's vantage point, right? But the other reason is because one of the things available to criminal investigators is taking a video of the crime scene. And that's something that we have not heard about in this case yet. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but typically on homicide cases, the crime scene specialist who documents the scene will go out and take video footage before they ever go out and take photographs, just to capture everything just as it is. And I would think that a video, as it relates to this type of expert, would be much more informative because you would see all of the different angles. If you think about it, this expert is looking at a flat photo that was taken years before. They have no way of recreating that entire scene and getting the entire view. And so I think, as it stands right now, this evidence was probably powerful to the state in terms of answering some of those questions about those last moments. But I suspect we'll see this really come under attack.
All right, let's talk about some of the things that we heard in the testimony. The blood on the tree. The idea that this may be Libby's blood, and as Emily described, maybe it was her hand on the tree. What do you make of that? Is that something that happened during a fight between the girls and the killer, or was this something that was done intentionally to send a message or to, say something?
Well, I think there's two reasonable interpretations of that evidence. And again, the jury gets that instruction. If there are two reasonable interpretations, you have to choose the one consistent with his innocence. But we know that they have been prohibited from developing that theory more as it relates to the potential cult evidence. I think it's perfectly logical that she could have leaned up against the tree, just even trying to balance herself after being injured and suffering from these injuries. So again, that's one of those things that we'll have to see how either party argues it. But for now, it has to be really curious to the jury.
Okay, another thing that was brought up during the testimony was this idea that Libby was dragged. So what do you make of the idea of why she was dragged? And again, why wouldn't we see DNA evidence on this young girl if in fact somebody dragged her from one position to another?
That's a really great point. And that is one of those pieces of evidence in this case that raises more questions than answers. Because we know from defense's opening that they plan to present the theory that this crime happened somewhere else and the girls' bodies were placed there away from the original crime scene. And so one thing that we heard from Bob and Emily was that there was admitted testimony that there's no drag marks on that scene. If her bloody body was dragged from one place to another, it seems that you would see a path that would show that blood being dragged. You would see an indentation in the leaves to show dragging. You would see the path of the leaves dragged. And so I think that's an interesting conclusion. And again, I suspect we'll probably see some challenges to that.
All right, and then we also heard that there was no blood on Abby's hands. What do you make of that?
Well, that's really interesting. That is definitely a point that raises more questions than answers because you have to consider, again, there's sort of these assumptions and this speculation about what happened. They're saying maybe she was in some way tied up, maybe her hands were tied up, maybe she was being held down, and all of that is speculation, and that's not good evidence for anyone, right? And you have to wonder why the inconsistency. We know that Libby had blood on her hands, and she had blood consistent with reacting to getting those wounds. Well, why wouldn't Abby have that as well? And of course, there's always the argument that no one can answer these questions except the person who committed this really heinous crime. But it certainly leaves a lot of unanswered questions that the jury could charge to either side.
So I know that, it's almost like we're looking at a scorecard every day. Based on what we've heard, DNA and blood today, was today a victory for the state? Was it a victory for the defense? Is there a split decision in there? What do you think?
I certainly don't think that it was a victory for the state today because from the DNA evidence, we know that it did nothing more for them. Richard Allen's DNA is not at that crime scene. The girl's DNA is not in any way associated with the things taken from Richard Allen's home. In terms of the defense, whether or not it was a gain for them, I would say today, yes. But again, we don't know how the state's going to tie that up in arguments. As to the blood evidence, it's really sort of hard to tell because, again, it depends on how they tie it up. And I think the evidence that we heard related to potentially the bodies were moved, but they gave an explanation. The defense has planted the seed that the bodies were moved from an entirely different location. Their expert has now said that, yes, the body was moved, but from point A to B within the same crime scene.
Right.
And so I can't see where that did anything for the state, but I think we have to wait on that to determine because we haven't heard all the evidence. And so it really highlights that instruction that the jury gets, reserve your judgment until all the evidence is in. So I don't think that it's our scorecard would probably be fair at this point because we don't necessarily know what's coming tomorrow, but I certainly don't think there were any gains in tipping the scales for the state today in a positive way in their direction.
All right, so what you've heard in terms of analysis is all based on what we heard today, but Bob and Emily also have some information about what happened on Saturday when the trial took place, and so maybe you can fill us in on what happened on Saturday.
Yeah, since our last Delphi debrief, we've actually had 2 days of testimony, and Emily, you had a front row seat on Saturday for that, and Lieutenant Jerry Holman from Indiana State Police. It was his second time testifying. The first time that he testified to the jury was talking about the first time that he interviewed Richard Allen, and we know that that interview led to state police then getting a search warrant and searching his home. So on Saturday, he talked about the second time that he interviewed Richard Allen after that search warrant was issued and after they got what they consider to be some of their key evidence against him, which is that cartridge at the crime scene that the state says is linked to Richard Allen.
Right. He testified, Lieutenant Holman testified on Saturday about that October 26, 2022 interview that happened at the Lafayette State Police Post 2 weeks after this search warrant was issued. Now, we know that he testified that they had arranged for Richard Allen to come in and pick up his car. He and his wife, Kathy, were coming there, they thought, to pick up their car. And it was at that point that Lieutenant Holman said that he took Richard Allen into a room to talk to him some more. And he really talked about kind of the techniques that he had been trained in as far as discussing things with someone. And he said, first of all, you try and build a rapport with the person you're talking to. So he said he talked about his military service. Richard Allen apparently served in the military, so trying to build a rapport with Richard Allen about their mutual military service. After that, he says he pretty much presented him with the report that he had showing, he said that the cartridge matched Richard Allen's gun, and that Richard Allen insisted over and over again, I didn't have a gun on the trail that day. That cartridge didn't come from my gun. Then Holman testified that he actually lied to Richard Allen, that this is also an interview technique he said that he had been trained in. He told Richard Allen that they had experts who had analyzed the video and who could say definitively that that was Richard Allen on that video, and that this expert could also tell that that was his voice saying down the hill. And Richard Allen kept insisting no, and at one point he said this is Richard Allen, I'm not going to tell you something I didn't do. I don't care what you do to me. I'm not going to tell you something I didn't do. And Holman testified that Richard Allen, grew more and more agitated over the 2 hours after insisting that he had not done anything, and he cursed at Holman, and then Holman said, so I cursed back. It amped it up. So he was speaking this language, so I spoke his language back, is basically what he said.
And it was interesting because really Jerry Holman was revealing to the jury these interviewing techniques that someone who would be interviewing a murder suspect uses in an interrogation room. And it really gave the jury a lot of insight, including the fact that investigators will lie to suspects when they're doing these interrogations.
And another interesting part, Holman talked about how he left the room and Kathy Allen came in for a little bit and talked to her husband, and then Kathy left the room and said he came back in, and he told Richard Allen, look, your wife and I, we don't think you're a bad person. And Richard Allen said to Holman testified, Richard Allen said to him, what kind of good person kills 2 girls?
And interesting, he also told the jury that when he left the room and had Kathy Allen go in and talk with her husband, they were observing that conversation between the two of them as well.
And at the end of it all, Richard Allen basically says to him, and I'm paraphrasing, like, you're going to do what you're going to do, like, arrest me. And Holman said that he went outside then and consulted with the other folks. They thought that they had probable cause, and Richard Allen ended that interview in handcuffs.
Yeah. So again, really interesting testimony from state police, but the question is going to be, how does the jury interpret seeing state police, seeing the state investigator who interviewed Richard Allen essentially lie to him at one point in the deposition, and this was on cross-exam. In the deposition, he said, "Richard, I'm not lying to you.
That would be unethical."
He said that would be unethical, and yet he was lying to him. So how that's going to land with the jury will be interesting.
And they're going to get a chance to see that in the videos. They were talking about playing them on Saturday, and in the end it was decided, okay, we'll play those sometime next week. So we're going to see that October 26th video of Jerry Holman, and then we're also going to see that first questioning of Richard Allen October 13th.
I am really curious to see that because, in the courtroom, the jury, they're going to get to see exactly what Richard Allen's demeanor was as he was being interviewed, and I think just the way he presents himself, that will probably tell the jury a lot. So, want to mention today we had a new motion filed by the state. The state wants to introduce some evidence that we haven't heard anything about before.
Yeah, a Google search history. And they didn't say whose Google search history, but they had an email address attached to this Google search history, foodjacka0@gmail.com. This was after, obviously, the jury had left for the day, but they want to introduce some kind of Google search history. The defense argued against it, saying that the state basically needs to prove that it's only one person's Google search history, that not multiple people had access to whatever device this Google search history that they want to introduce is found on. And they cited some kind of case law, the state saying, okay, they were going to review that case tonight, the judge saying that she was going to take it under advisement, but the defense ending things saying that they're prepared, and Kathy Allen is willing to testify if needed about this specific motion.
Interesting that it's coming at this late point after the trial has already begun. So we'll see how the judge rules on that motion. We do want to show you some some new images for you from inside the courtroom. We're trying so hard to be able to bring you inside the courtroom with us. Today, I had the pleasure of sitting in the courtroom next to Libby. She is a sketch artist, and she is incredibly talented. Want to allow you to take a look at some of the sketches that she drew inside the courtroom today of the defense team, of Judge Gull, of Prosecutor Nick McLeland, of Richard Allen. When I tell you that some of these are essentially more pictures than sketches, or photographs more than sketches, that's how accurate Lee's sketches are. So our thanks to Lee, and we'll have those sketches to be showing you. You'll see more of those here over the next couple of weeks. Again, since we're not allowed to have any cameras in the courtroom. And Chris Webb, I want to ask our photojournalist here if he would quickly zoom in behind us. Take a look right now. That is the main entrance right now to the Carroll County Courthouse behind us. I'm counting, wow, it looks like there's already about 15 chairs and people who are lined up back there just getting ready. Here we are hours and hours before the doors open to the courthouse at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning, before the courtroom doors open at 8:30 tomorrow morning. People are already lining up 12 hours before tomorrow's hearing. That's how much interest there is in this case. We have been really fortunate to be able to have a front row seat to bring you every day's testimony. We will be back in the courtroom tomorrow, and we certainly appreciate you joining us on these Delphi debriefs. Scott, we'll send it back to you.
Yeah, Bob and Emily, before I let you go, I do have one question about the cartridge. So the state earlier in testimony said the cartridge that was found at the crime scene belonged to a gun that Richard Allen had, that it had been ejected, not fired. Today, did the DNA expert talk about DNA, if anything, was found on that cartridge at the crime scene?
She did. Stacy Bozinovski, she talked about the fact that there was no DNA that was able to be taken off of that cartridge, and the deputy prosecutor said, help the jury understand that. And so she explained the cartridge is so small and that it just is not really a good piece of evidence to be able to take DNA evidence off of. So she said, based on that and based on the fact that someone who is handling a cartridge would not really handle it very much, she talked about something called touch DNA. And it comes into play both with that cartridge and potentially with a suspect or the murderer who would be moving the bodies. The DNA expert was asked to explain touch DNA and what that is. And, you know, she talked about the fact that if someone touches your hand, is that enough to leave DNA? And she said it could be, but it also could not be. It depends how long that touch took place, how hard the touch took place. She said it's not really the best way to be able to get DNA. She said that blood and saliva, fantastic sources to be able to get DNA, but other things like hair follicles, if they don't have the root attached to them, not good for DNA. Simple touch is not good. Urine, things like that, not good for DNA.
And that blood can drown out other DNA. When there's a lot of blood,
yes,
it's essentially what it drowns everything else out.
Yeah. So she did explain, Scott, why I guess the jury might not read too much into the fact that there was no DNA found on that cartridge, which again the state is alleging is linked directly at one point cycled through the gun owned by Richard Allen.
Bob and Emily doing a great job up in Delphi. We'll see you tomorrow in Carroll County for more coverage here on our Delphi Debrief. I want to bring our legal expert back in to talk a little bit more about the Saturday testimony. So this Indiana State Police investigator and the interrogation techniques that we heard them talk about, that he admits to lying to Richard Allen while he's interviewing him. How does that land with the jury, and is this consistent with other investigative techniques, if you will?
So my experience has been that jurors do not like that because it is deception, but our courts have concluded, our higher courts, when evaluating this sort of conduct, they've concluded that it's permissible. It's permissible as an investigative technique. The idea is if someone is truly guilty, they're not going to, or truly innocent, on the other hand, they're not going to be influenced by someone lying to them because they know what the facts are. But it's just not true. You can be influenced by that. And we have seen a body of work related to false confessions that people make. And so it's troubling. And more often than not, jurors relay that they find it to be troubling as an investigative technique. Any
other takeaways from either today's testimony or the testimony that we heard from Saturday's witness?
Sure. As to Saturday's testimony, I think once we were able to learn about Richard Allen's follow-up statements to that original statement outside of his home when the search warrant was being served, we heard last week that he said, "It's over. It's over." And so now we heard that when Holman followed up on that statement, Richard Allen explained, "You've talked to my coworkers, you've been out in the community asking questions about me, you've ruined my life. It's over for me." And so that gives a little more context to that, and I think that's important. I think it's also important that we heard that he blanketly denied these allegations or any involvement 20 to 25 times, right? Because we're going to later hear testimony that he later confesses to these crimes. So I think it's important that the jury was able to hear that initially when he was of sound mind, when he was in the comfort still of his home, before he was taken away to this pretrial detention facility, he did deny it. The other thing that I thought was interesting is that he gave no explanation as to why a bullet linked to him may have been out on that scene. In fact, he said, "I don't believe you. that didn't happen. And that cuts both ways, because one could argue that if he were truly guilty, he inserted himself into this investigation, remember?
Right, remember he called the tip line a few days after the murders.
Absolutely. And so if he were simply trying to cover his tracks in that regard, he could have covered his tracks and said, yes, I go out there hunting all the time. It makes sense that a bullet connected to me would be out there, but he didn't do that. He said, there's no way. And so now today, when we hear questions from jurors about the security of how the evidence is kept, their quality controls, it has you thinking if they're wondering if there's some sort of conspiracy where evidence could have been planted. So I think now that we're seeing more and more witnesses, we're able to tie some things that we heard earlier, even juror questions, to some things that we're hearing later. And that's pretty interesting in terms of gauging which side is doing what on that scorecard.
Yeah, Katie Jackson-Lindsay doing a great job breaking this down. We are with you every weeknight at 10 o'clock here on WTHR Plus, doing this deep dive so you can better understand how this case is unfolding. Since we don't have any cameras in the courtroom, we want to make sure that our reporters who are listening to all the testimony are giving you all the details so you can learn all about this big case. In fact, you can find our ongoing coverage, including detailed reports on each day of this trial, by going to WTHR.com/Delphi. Thanks for joining us.